So if we can go to the next slide, the next thing I just want to say before we get going any further is many of you have already started to look at the data, and almost certainly you will find mistakes, you will find errors, you'll find things that are missing. We really embrace the fact that we've done the best we possibly can, but with our limited resources and our limited team, there's only so much we can do. And so we are very, very keen to collaborate and work with others. And so one of the key things we want people to take away from this seminar is that there are many ways for you to get involved, even just kind of sending us critique or telling us that we missed something. And we've tried to make this as easy as possible on the website for you to do. Everything from just filling out a form to booking in time with us. We want it to be as frictionless as possible for you to give us feedback. And so I'm very, very much hoping that people out there will take us up on that and will offer us kind of corrections, new pieces of data, or thoughts or ideas about how we can improve this map. Okay. The next thing I want to do is I'd like to introduce, we have one kind of guest speaker who's going to just talk a little bit about the map and their hope for it. And I'm so excited she's here because one of the true joys in doing this work is that it caused us to kind of reach around the world and kind of find out who else has been thinking about these ideas, who's been thinking about this problem. And Sabine Mensah of an incredible organization called African Inda has just been like an incredible partner and a total delight to get to know. Every single time we've got on a Zoom call with her, she's had incredible insight, incredible contributions to make, really kind of thoughtful dialogue. And so when it comes to launch, I was like, I could not think of someone better who's both of this community, but I hope also going to be a user of this tool to come just talk a little bit about her own experience and how this might be helpful and some of her own work. So Sabine, let me turn over to you.
Thank you very much, David. Quite a pleasure to be here on the line with you and all the different colleagues who have contributed to this work. And it truly is a pleasure for me to stand up for my entire team and our entire organization at African Inda. Just for those who don't know us, African Inda is really a philanthropic program working in Africa with governments, regulators, private sector association, and other development partners to scale up the development of instant payment systems so that we can accelerate financial inclusion. Our hope is that by the work that we're doing collectively in the countries, we are able to facilitate universal access to financial services by 2030 for all Africans. I think that my being here today, it's actually what I call the coalition of the willing. We had been working on mapping, landscaping instant payment systems in Africa, and we have a report that we put out every year called the State of Inclusive Instant Payment System. In that report, we map out the payments layer of digital public infrastructure, and we do it with a focus on Africa. So when we met and I understood the scope of your project, which was more a global and holistic view of what DPI, the state of DPI is across the world, it was just like, yes, this is what we need. So it was a perfect marriage, I would say, of us trying to make sure that we have that holistic view from a payments layer perspective, and you coming in and looking at it from a global perspective, and also all the different layers, including identity and also the data piece. So that already I was sold on it. But I think what I really want to stress is that every time we are working with countries, we start by understanding the bigger picture, of financial inclusion, but also of the different pillars, whether there is digital identity in the ecosystem, whether there are data systems that are interoperable that, financial service providers and others can tap into it. So by having a tool such as the DPI map, it makes our job and our interaction with our partners much, much easier, because for each country, we can take a look and say, we know that you already are involved into identity layers of the DPI. We know from the report that we're doing ourselves on SIPs that you're working on the payment system, and we understand based on this map that there are also projects on the data side. So I think it would be a very useful tool, not only for project owners themselves at a country level, but also for all of the enablers that are in the ecosystem working together to ensure that we are enabling inclusive digital public infrastructure in Africa and in the world in general. So back to you, David, and thank you for associating African Inda to this initiative.
Sabine, thank you so much. if we can maybe put a link to Africa and in the chat, maybe a link to, if we can, to one of the more recent reports, then that'd be wonderful. For me, again, one of the real joys of this has been finding these partners around the world, of which Sabine and Africa have been just an excellent, just a perfect example of a real ecosystem out there that's thinking about these problems and trying to be engaged and helpful. So Sabine, thank you so much for carving out time today to join us. Christina, if we could pull back up the slide. Perfect. So I want to talk a little bit about the journey that got us to this place, and why create the map? What was the journey that got us here, and what were we trying to accomplish? So this started about a year and a half ago, when I was in some rooms and people started talking about, kind of how do more countries start doing DPI? There was some talk about maybe doing a 50 and 5 campaign, which is to try to get 50 countries to do 50 DPIs in the next 5 years. And I sat there and I kept thinking to myself, like, well, what is the current end? Like, what is the current state? And really nobody had kind of a grasp of that. There was definitely a sense that there was a lot going on in India. The Estonians were clearly doing something. Brazil had picked. And so people would often say, well, 3, because that's kind of what they knew. And my suspicion was that number was a lot higher. And part of that came out of the fact that I had become very close to the excellent people at NICE, the Nordic Institute for Interoperability Studies. And I knew that the X-Road data exchange system had already been deployed in several countries. And so I knew that that number was already a little bit north of just even the 3 that were NICE members. And so I said, well, we have to, if we want to track what's happening around the world, we have to have some mechanism to do that. And it wasn't just me thinking that, there were several people were. And so we began to play around with the idea of how would we do that. And so that led to a series of kind of core research goals, which was, how might we determine how many DPIs exist in the world? How would we even begin to measure what a DPI is? And then do these different kind of core DPIs, specifically identity, data exchange, and payments, do they share enough common attributes that would make it possible to kind of measure them in any kind of coherent way? And if we go to the next slide, the kind of core hypothesis that we had was that there was probably a lot more DPI or DPI-like systems out there than people realized. Let's go to the next slide. The piece here is, as we got into this work, I really want to acknowledge the constraint, just so you're aware of how our data is also constrained. And we've tried to document all of our thinking, everything as clearly as we possibly can, to really allow other researchers and others to understand what the constraints are on the data that we've collected. The first is, there are really only normative definitions of DPI. And we are kind of actually reluctant to create a data set that says, oh, this person has DPI and this person doesn't. And so one of the big parts of our research was actually breaking down what a DPI is into several attributes, and what are the things that we think make up a DPI. That includes not just the technical layer, but the governance layer as well. And then what are the indicators, what are the ways that we'd actually try to measure that? And our real goal was trying to get to things that we could look at would be kind of binary and unbiased, that would be a demonstrating evidence that that attribute existed. And I was really kind of in part both inspired, but recognizing the limits of the UN survey that tends to happen on the kind of e-government survey. And I remember being part of the committee that determined the questions on that and being quite frustrated, but recognizing the need for real binary questions about, like, does something exist or does something not exist? Because what I don't want is our team kind of interpreting or making judgment about whether something exists or not. So we try as best we can to really come up with binary, unbiased measurements. And that's also to help us, because a lot of our work to date has been just research driven. So how can we go and do the research and kind of identify whether those things exist or not? And so the goal was to recognize this constraint, create a methodology that would be robust and effective, and it would actually gather data that would be useful to people, and particularly useful to researchers, public servants in governments that are thinking about doing DPIs or trying to learn from peers, policymakers who are thinking about regulating the space, the builders of DPI who are out there working in digital public goods, who are thinking about building things out, technical advisors, and then of course also all the advocates out there, advocates for DPI themselves, but also advocates who are concerned with issues of security and issues of privacy, issues of inclusion. How can our data support all of them and the work that they're doing? So this is really who we're thinking about. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So before I share a few insights, I just want to kind of reiterate again, there's kind of no clear demarcation of like when you're at DPI and when you're not at DPI. And we've actually purposely tried to avoid doing that. Our goal is actually going to set up a range, like a set of attributes with a range of indicators, and simply say, like, here are the indicators that we could find and we could identify as existing, and allow others to debate, where might DPI start and where might DPI not start. That said, we are going to draw our insights. We'll kind of talk a little bit about where we think DPI exists. And that generally clusters around places that have many, 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 not all, but many, many, many of the indicators that have been satisfied. The other thing is just like, it turns out that not all indicators are uniform across all three DPIs. So we actually ended up with 68 unique indicators. One of the reasons I worked so hard to thank the team at the beginning of the research is they're working diligently to go around and try to identify all 68 indicators in each country that we're looking at to see if they exist. And as we looked across the 16 indicators, I do also want to recognize there are many instances where there still remains holes in our data. We found no data either disqualifying, saying the indicator didn't exist, or confirming that the indicator did exist. So I would say almost half of the indicators in the country we looked at have kind of no answer to them. We don't know if it exists. We don't know. We couldn't confirm either way. That all said, there are many interesting observations we can make about the ecosystem, and I'd like to make a few of those very quickly right now. So as I said at the beginning, our hypothesis is that there were probably a great more DPI-type systems than previously thought, and I think that hypothesis has generally been validated. So we have found 46 systems that do identity. I'll talk about why I think that number is interesting. 38 payment systems out there and 46 data exchange systems out there. This is vastly greater than the number of kind of 3 to 10 that I know I was batting around even about 12 to 18 months ago, significantly more. Now, I do want to kind of qualify, if we go to the next slide, I want to qualify this, which is to say, we again don't take a firm stand on how many attributes you have to have or how many indicators you have to satisfy in order to be a DPI. So these numbers are actually doing two things. So for identity, it's actually looking at what countries self-declare that they have a digital identity system, and that we were able to validate that those countries' digital IDs allow citizens to authenticate themselves into a service of some form. And that's 46, but I think it's still a surprisingly high number. For payments, there's a huge number of the payment systems out there. The 38 is actually those that are operated by a public interest entity. So that's typically a national bank, but it might be some other form of entity as possible as well. And for data exchange, this is basically the ones that are government operated. So we have not found anything that are kind of private sector operated that we were able to validate. So these are private sector operated. And I think what's interesting about this number too is it doesn't include Europe. And I know our friends NICE are listening in, and so it doesn't even count Estonia and Finland and now Iceland that are actually the core users and implementers of X-Road. So this number is definitely going to go north as we begin to expand our data set. We can go to that next slide, Christina. Okay, again, just really want to kind of acknowledge the constraint. We are limited by the data. We're limited by our access to data. We were desk research driven. There are definitely gaps that are still out there. And one of the things we're hoping for is that people out there might tell us where we've missed things. There might be insiders who have knowledge that we simply were not able to find. We would love nothing more than to get that feedback from you. The other is I just also want to acknowledge, like, we had to ultimately rely on a definition of what is a DPI or what are the attributes of a DPI. That's a normative exercise. And we tried to chronicle in detail in our methodology section how we arrived at that definition. But what I do want to say is it involved a huge number of consultations, both with implementers, but also with subject matter experts. And what we really tried to identify is what should a DPI have? What is a safe, inclusive DPI that has good governance? What are all of the attributes it would have? And use those as the benchmark we're using. And we have a huge number of stakeholders out there that we are trying to thank. We're currently thanking a bunch of them, but there's a bunch more that we're trying to get approval from to thank them on our website that range from NGOs to government to private sector actors. Okay, let me just go quickly now through some additional insights. So on digital identity, we looked at 132 countries in all, and what you can see here is there are many, many countries that claim to have a digital ID, at least 75 that we could find. And many of those actually do have some sort of Privacy Act or some sort of data protection law, but at least it exists in a general sense across the country that provides some sense of governance over the domain that digital identity should be touching. That said, like the numbers that have specific acts or something for about identity is kind of like much more limited. And so I think this year there's like really interesting data to dive into to start doing some comparison of kind of what countries are doing, what countries are not doing, and what they could learn from each other. If we go to the next slide. On payments, we found 156. That number you may notice higher than the number of countries we studied. That's because some countries have more than one payment system. So you might have multiple in one country. The kind of real crux is like out of that total 156, the vast majority are not publicly oriented. But if you look down and if you zeroed in on instant payment systems, there actually what's interesting is just over half of those are actually run by a public entity. So if you go to the next slide here, you'll see this breakdown that we have on our website that talks about like central banks actually running about 38 of the kind of 38 of the kind of 75 instant payment systems that are out there. This number actually don't all add up, and we checked that in our methodology again. It's because some of these things actually are kind of edge cases and behave a little bit differently. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. On data exchange, this was the most difficult category for us to engage with. It is kind of like the least well-defined. It's much less well-defined than digital identity and payments. Payments in particular is, kind of almost ubiquitous. Everywhere in the world is either has or is trying to figure out how to have some sort of digital payment system. Whereas data exchange, here, the kind of how you would even define this is much more up for grabs. And this can, you'll see here in the bullets here, this could include anything from like data trust, consent-based data sharing models, to kind of more centralized models where the government is just sharing data with inside the government context and not with private sector actors. You could also have sectorally based systems that are either fully or partially have partial government intervention in them, like healthcare is a very common one to think about. So we really, this is a much more difficult space to wrap your arms around. But even in this space, there's some really exciting findings. If we go to the next slide, the first most important one is there are, there's a lot more action in this space than I think people realize. People think that data sharing, particularly within government, is difficult. Certainly, outside, across private sector and government, even more difficult. But shockingly, there are 46 of these projects that are active just in the 132 countries we looked at. And I know that there are some in the countries we haven't been able to look at yet. So this number is definitely going to get higher. So there's a lot going on. And I think one of the challenges here is these systems, the governments are still learning how to operationalize, not just in the kind of technological sense, but in the actual kind of process sense of how to share data and where does it make sense and what are the kind of policies and rules you need to get in place to do that with trust and do it effectively. That's still being figured out. So even some of these implementations, I want to be clear, they may exist and there may be sharing of data going on, but it's a highway that only has a few cars working on it. It's not a busy highway with lots of cars moving on it. So there's huge room for growth here as well. If we can go to the next slide. The other thing that's really interesting about the data exchange space is how evenly spread it is around the world. It wasn't like it was concentrated in Africa or concentrated in LATAM. You really did see instances of this in almost every region we looked at. And I think that will continue to be the case as we begin to expand into the rest of Asia, and then Europe and North America. And then finally, that last slide is, I just wanted to reiterate, like, if we can go to the next, oh yeah, here it is, perfect. No, sorry, went back one, sorry, Christina. Here, we were, again, really reliant on a number of partners who were super helpful. We're very grateful to the team at Nice, because they're the curators of the code base that's used by Estonia, Finland, Iceland, but then also by many others. And what's fascinating is they make up a huge percentage of the data exchange systems that are out there. So X-Road is the kind of open source version. UXT is a proprietary fork of that. And so together, they're already about 20. That's about somewhere between a half and 2/3 of the whole ecosystem right there alone. And then the kind of like enterprise service buses are more kind of custom solutions that seem to have been built that are out there. So this space is still growing quite a lot, but there is kind of some dominant players out there already. Okay, again, this is where the URL is, and I want to hand over to Christina, who's been doing a ton of amazing work to make this whole project happen, and she's going to talk more about how to use these tools.
Thank you, David. And thanks everyone for still staying on board. It's 30 minutes through. We still see a lot more attendees pouring in. This webinar will be recorded and it'll be hosted on our website. So just so you know, and you'd want to share this with someone you know, feel free to share the link, of course, but these resources will be hosted also. A quick note about a question that came up in chat. The geographical spread of this data focuses on Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, and the South and Southeast parts of Asia. That's obviously not a global map yet, but I think that just speaks to the iterative nature of this work, which is that we're going to take feedback, we're going to build, and this is going to be a global map very soon. But we rely very heavily on your feedback. What I'm going to take you through is ways to engage with the website, the DPI map, but also very specific ways to engage with two tools. So let me take you to the map first, and the URL is here for you to see. You're going to look at, of course, the map is an Excel sheet right now. We've segregated them into identity systems, payment systems, data exchange systems. And while there is still debate on why not other deployments, can we speak of other types of DPI? We can, for sure. I don't think this is a final stage. We believe this will expand from here. But for now, and the definitions we go by, we're sticking to IDs, payments, and exchanges, and that's the categorization you'll see across this project. On the left, you'll see views that let you switch between the three types of components. But at the bottom of the same page, you'll also find a country overview, which lets you have an overview of what are the deployments across IDs, payments, and exchanges across these countries in our sample size. And what are the names of the deployments, not assessing the types of features these deployments have, not assessing whether they possess the kind of attributes we're interested in, just assessing what are the names and can I go and hunt for them myself. And on the right, you'll see a view of how to access this database. A very interesting feature is the filter right on top, where you're able to access regional level views of this database. And this lets you maybe analyze this data based on regions, or it lets you download the whole country database as a whole, which is accessible, I think, on the URL that one of my team members will share in the chat box. You should be able to download all of this data as a raw file, filter it based on your own needs, and look at the quality of data. Also look at the kind of insights you can derive yourself. So we've given you a few views to play around because we do think there's interest in a global view as well as regional views. But based on more feedback on how you plan to engage with this data, this can expand. A very interesting view is also a country view. If you click on any of the countries, it should take you to a country page of how that particular country's deployment in the ID or the payments or the data exchange space is doing, specifically how the country's deployment exhibits characteristics and qualities that we are interested in. And I'll in a moment, I'll speak to what these characteristics and qualities are and how we arrived at them. But we're also very transparent about the data we did not find and how we looked for the data, which is, again, all downloadable on our website through URLs that will come to you in a minute. At the top of the DPI map website, you should also find a link to download the data. So this is just to highlight that. And now, what I think is the most exciting part and why this project's taken so many months to get off ground and to this virtual screen in front of you is a methodology. And the methodology, again, accessible on this URL, speaks to how did we get here? How did we think about DPI as a concept? Did we look at a real world deployment? Did we just treat it normatively? How did we make these two ends meet? So the methodology URL and the page itself will explain in detail. Again, in addition to this, there's going to be a paper that comes out that takes you through the sources of our work and exactly what went into our desk investigations. But it gives you some detail on how to understand this translation from a normative concept to a real-world deployment and our lens to measuring it. On the right of the methodology page, you should be able to screen and click on the ID indicators and the framework of how we studied this, as well as payments and data exchanges. This is the crux of our methodology. It's two things. On the left, you'll see an inductive process. We try to understand mostly through desk research. And when I say desk research, I mean a lot of practice-oriented documents as well. We looked at the latest Safeguards Initiative work. We looked at World Bank's knowledge. We looked at subject matter expert publications in the payment space, in the ID space, in the exchange space, on what values, what qualities, what characteristics DPI should hold. What takes something from being an ID system to being an ID system that's DPI. And we tried to find those that were common and those that really spoke to the essence of DPI as a concept. We found 4. They're listed in the pillars here: interoperability and extensibility, transparency, accountability and oversight, privacy, protection, security, and inclusion and non-discrimination. 2 ideas that are also important to using these attributes and understanding them better is how they engage with 2 pieces. One is the capacity and coordination of the unit that's building the DPI, typically a government department, but also the ecosystem it engages with, and scale and adoption. Who uses the DPI, to what extent? Is it variable? Are different actors in the ecosystem actually engaging with it as a piece of infrastructure versus just treating it as a static piece of public service delivery? This as a whole, these 6 elements are what we call attributes, but a note that might not have been too clear is that the attributes that we're really interested in are the 4 pillars. The 2 elements that you see on the side are ways to understand whether or not the DPI is doing its job well enough. And this is what you'll see articulated in the framework as well. There'll be 6 attributes because we try and study these attributes through what we're calling indicators. The indicators are on the right. They're mostly derived through a deductive process where we're trying to find effective norms, rules, processes, technologies to achieve these attributes. How do DPI deployments go out into the real world and actually make the attributes real and tangible? These are what we call outcome indicators, and they can be segregated in different ways. They can be measurable, immeasurable, and they can also be what we call good to have or must have. Now, this can be viewed subjectively, but our understanding of good to have and must have is a must have indicator is something that speaks to the essence of digital public infrastructure. It also happens to be very commonly found across deployments, and it should be a goal ideally for all deployments. Good to have indicator may not be that much of an essence. It might not be that core to our understanding of the DPI, but we've seen it as a augmentative or a better to have feature among a lot of deployments. So we featured those 2, and our framework calls these out specifically. Of course, based on your understanding of it, you might have feedback on what must be a good to have and what must be a must have. We give you the framework to edit as you please. For our purposes of measurement, we treated some things as good to have and must have, but it might change for how you plan to use the framework for your purposes. And we're open to receiving that feedback and also displaying your view on these things on the website at some point. A note on how to access these. If you go to dpimap.org/payments framework, identity framework, data exchange framework, you should reach a screen like these. Attributes are on the left, which are 6 in number that I just explained. We've made the order transparent. Is it must have or good to have? And we've given you an indication of what the indicator is and what our understanding of it is. So you understand If it's conflated with another indicator, you definitely know what separates one indicator from the other. And this is the exciting bit. We not only created an indicator framework, which is a more conceptual understanding of how to study DPI, but we pressure tested it. We took the indicators, which you see right on the top, came up with ways to measure each indicator, which we call data points or metrics. And we've listed them in an Excel sheet that you should find on the chat somewhere, but it's already also on our website. Now, this exercise was sort of pressure testing our framework and saying, what is truly measurable and can we measure it? And in arriving at these data points, we had to have a lot of debates. Most of them can be summarized as, is it truly measurable? What is the data points that's measurable? Based on our methodology of how we collect data and how we report data on the DPI map, is the data public? And if it's public, is it accessible? Further to that, can we truly measure the indicator, or can we just measure a proxy of it? And very often when you're relying on public data sets or publicly reported data, it's often a proxy of it, but we've been transparent about it. So you'll see the extent to which, for example, with a specific indicator here that I've called out around interoperability and extensibility, we're trying to study if there's domain-specific interoperability or cross-domain interoperability within a payment system, and there's different ways to measure it. You might either look at the participants, you might look at the rules of the payment system and whether it has a vision for it, or you might look at the value and volume of transactions and who engages and who conducts these transactions. We've tried and tested different ways to measure it. Some have been more successful than the others. And if we've been successful, we've reported the data back. If not, we've reported it as a challenge that we've faced in collecting this data. So you should find all this information on the downloadable sheets on the website. Again, we'll link these to you if you can't find them. And that's it. I should not. Yeah, I should pause now and say that we want to, these are painted as matched outputs here. You see it as a linear progression, but they're really two unique ones. I think I look at the framework more as a methodology to inform work that not only we do, but also our partners, peers and researchers, policymakers are doing in the space to try and make DPI a more tangible concept. And the DPI map is a very transparent blackboard on what we're succeeding at and what we're failing at, because you'll see data that's bad on there as well. But that just means that we need more information from you to make it better. Yeah, I'll pause there and hand it back to David. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. So I think, Christina, if you could just share, go back to the slide. If you can go to slide 30, it's not that it says what's next, but I have some additional insights I just wanted to share quickly. If you can go to the next slide, slide 31. I think the other thing that I just really wanted to share with everybody that I think makes this research so exciting is that I think there's a narrative that DPI is somehow a new thing, or is something that's arisen in the last several years or out of one specific country. And I think the other big conclusion of our research is that one is that actually DPI has actually experienced a lot of parallel evolution. There are many countries around the world that have been working on this. They worked on it in parallel and in isolation at times. So one of the things that hope to my map is actually countries will now see others have been doing similar things that they thought that they were doing on their own, and there's like opportunities to learn. That's also true of the research community, of the NGO community, of the implementer community. So there's been a lot more parallel evolution. The other piece of this is what I think is so interesting is our data only looks at the global south at the moment, and not all of it. We have not really looked at the global north. But what I think is so interesting is many of the examples of what we've seen are things that originated out of the global south. So this is a phenomenon that I think DPI more generally is a global south-led phenomena where the innovations and the ideas have really come out of that part of the world. And And I think this data may begin to support that, especially as we do more work in the global north and we begin to be able to make that comparison. But I think that hypothesis strikes me as very, very exciting. And the other is that the work of DPI has been going on for much longer than anybody realized. Even if you look at something like the X-Road in Estonia, that's going back, 15, 20 plus years now. But it's not the only one. There's several of these types of implementations we found that actually go back in their date from several years ago. And so this is not something that one country can take credit for. This isn't something that one company can take credit for. This is something that's really happening in parallel in many, many places and has been happening for quite some time. I think it's very, very interesting. Okay, before we go to questions, let me just talk about what's going to happen next. So we do have a roadmap, and the team here, Christine, Julia, and Christina, have all are working hard with me to try to continue to push things forward. And we have a few things that are on our mind. So one is we'd like to try to run a number of workshops in the coming months, just to help researchers and others out there, learn how to use this data set, understand the constraints and limits of it, support them in their research. So if there's anything we can do to be helpful, we're really interested in hearing about, what types of workshops you'd like to have. We have some ideas about what would be helpful, but it's always great to hear from users and learn what they actually want. So that's one thing we'd very much like to do. The second is, and this came up in the questions, I think it was Alexander who asked the question, I'm not sure, but it was like, are you going to do the global north? It seems mostly global south. You're 100% right. We really wanted to get what we had out the door, but our goal is by the end of this calendar year that we will finish up the rest of Asia and then also add on Oceania, Europe, and North America to get a full global data set in everybody's hands so they can use that as a basis for research and other activities. And then the other is we do want to kind of more formally document our work. So you'll see on our website, there's a methodology section, but we'd like to turn that into something that's a little bit more of a formal paper that people can use to really allow people to question us and bring some more kind of academic rigor to that to really kind of reinforce the work and also help us inform future versions of the data collection that we're going to be doing. So this is kind of what's next for us. And then I'd be remiss, if you leave with nothing from today, the one thing I want you to know is we really want you to be a partner with us. We'd love to hear from you. So again, if you see gaps or holes or problems, we tried to make this as frictionless as possible for you to reach out and connect with us. We really want to hear from you. We'd love to know if there's data that's missing in our map. So if you have any ideas or information, please do share it with us. We would love nothing more than to hear from you. And this may be a thing that we also just choose to run a workshop on, which is like, how you can help us find more data. And also how can we kind of reference and cite new partners who've been contributing to our work. Okay, with that, Julia, should I turn back to you? Do you want to manage a little bit of Q&A? I know some questions have come in and we've been trying to answer them as they come, but there's probably more still.
Yes, we have some questions that are similar. I'm going to start by pulling them off and handing it to you. So we have a couple of questions, one from Alexandre and another one, which are focused on mapping of sectoral DPIs. So I'm just going to bring them here. But Alexandre asked if we touch upon any other examples, considering, for example, DPI for education, that can be critical for digital public infrastructures, and DPIs also for the judicial system. So just handing it off to you and pulling these questions here to our chat.
Yeah, I'd love to give Christina a chance to respond to this as well. Christina, do you want to take a first cut or?
Yes, I can share from our journey. We started with the sector. We tried scoping out the health sector. We received feedback that a lot of health data exchanges kind of inform the sector agnostic data exchanges that exist in countries. We've tried and reached out to organizations that have already set this up. We don't need to redo anyone's work. And there do exist there's enough information on sectoral health data exchanges out there, apparently. The one thing we found in taking a sectoral view to this is that very many sectors do it very differently. So for us, from public data to gather which of these sectoral initiatives could be sector agnostic pieces of infrastructure in the country is quite challenging. We would love for the map to have a view on how different sectors are conducting IDs, payments, exchanges eventually. But I think it seems like a V4 version of what you see here today, just because there is a dearth of collated knowledge and information on these sectoral pieces. So yes, the summary is sectoral initiatives can be part of this work, but I don't think in the very near future. But if you have feedback on these databases that already exist, we're happy to scrape and make it part of this bigger database, just so folks who are reading this database and filtering through these views have all of this knowledge summarized in one place.
Yeah, the main thing I would just add is we do have very limited resources, and so we have to constantly making choices about what we're able to do and what we have to keep in scope versus out of scope. And so just candidly, that does influence what we can do. I would love nothing more than to think about, I think particularly education and health are two verticals that are very, very interesting. And maybe in the future we can, but just as Christina mentioned, it's very, very challenging from a methodological perspective to include them. It's a great question.
So pulling off another interesting question brought by John, it is, to what extent were countries engaged in this process, either to provide information or validate information you've sourced from the public domain?
Christina, why don't you go first? I feel like
Yeah,
you're smiling. You go.
We now have a country questionnaire, which serves as an interview when we speak with anyone either working within government, in partnership with government, or with a bunch of different governments, just so they can use this framework and this data scoping methodology to assess what the state of DPI is in that country. So we've had partners who reached out to us for this questionnaire. We've shared it with them, and they've conducted these interviews, reported back. But again, now it's going to become a capacity constraint. The reason we've relied on public data and reported data and published data is because given the scope of countries we wanted to look into, which is 4 continents, we only had the means so far to reach into secondary databases or publicly published information about country-specific deployments. So far, we haven't done a lot of country interviews. We have sampled it out to see how much it takes to get this information out of a country. And it takes quite a bit of effort. It involves figuring out who the right person to talk to is, trying and triangulating the right kind of data point and the information so that we can upload it on this system, and then making sure that it's happening in more or less a standard way across countries. But if you're interested in it, and if you have information on a country level deployment, we have a form on our website that makes you being able to report this data back to us very simple. It takes about a minute. We basically ask you for any information you have and then organize it on the back end ourselves. So if you do have this information, fill out the form. If you think it might take more than a form, we've shared a Calendly link so that you can book a 30-minute meeting or interview, and feel free to share this with anyone who has information. We're happy to conduct these interviews going forward to see what data scoping with country level partners looks like.
Again, the only thing I'd want to add is for this phase, we really focus on desk research for reasons of kind of scale and figuring out who the right person to talk to in 132 countries. And it probably wouldn't be one, it'd probably be 5 different people to talk to, and maybe 10 in 132 countries was simply too challenging. But we have tried to validate what we have done with some people in countries. That said, I feel like we've entered a new phase now, and with the site, with the map now up, and with our ways of contributing, we would love nothing more than to hear from countries who want to reach out to us and say, we think you have our data wrong. Here's how we'd like to correct it. Have them show us the evidence of, like, where they feel like the indicator is getting met, or even just to talk to us, and we could help figure that out. We would love nothing more than that. So if there is a representative from a country on this call, we would love to hear from you. And if you're connected to people who are working in countries who are overseeing DPIs, we would love to hear from them. Please pass that along.
Nice. I'm going to pull off two questions at the same time just to use our time, optimize the time. The first one from Charles is what kinds of applications do you see for the mapping and the consolidated data repository? Will things like standards or other public information systems be able to access this for applications for the benefit of the public or for public institutions? And the other question is, of the total number of instances in the map now, which you list as a DPI and how many call themselves as a DPI? And I think this is a relevant point we discussed a lot, so that's why I pulled this question as well.
So maybe let me start with the second one first and then come back to the first one. And I'm sure Christina's going to want to add some pieces as well. So we've shied away from trying to label what is a DPI versus at what point do you cross some threshold into becoming a DPI versus not being a DPI. What we try to do is chronicle what we think are all of the attributes that one needs to have to be an inclusive, safe, and effective DPI. And so we try to map those out. And I would love nothing more than to have a debate and have there be a debate about how many of those attributes and how many of those indicators need to be satisfied before one suddenly qualifies as being a DPI. But I don't feel like we are the arbiters of that at the moment. The goal of this project is simply to try to create that set of data that we think needs to be fulfilled, and then offer that up to the community for research and for debate and for conversation to help figure that out. So we don't kind of come down hard on that, and I don't think that we will. But I would love nothing more than for someone else to take our data set and for them to make that choice and then hold people to that standard. We just want to make sure we're collecting data to inform a conversation. On the first part of the question, my memory is like losing path. So I'm like, do I remember the first part? Christina, why don't you take the first part and I'll remember.
The first one is about the applications that we see for the mapping and the consolidated data repository.
Oh, so one is, so we see this data set as an infrastructure that we're hoping others will use, like researchers, like anybody in the community, we want to use it there. And so there's no limit on the use of this data. We only ask that you cite us when you're using this data. But beyond that, the data is really available for anyone to build on top of or for anyone to use. And we've actually already been talking to partners, some of whom are working kind of in more specialized areas, who would like to use our data set as a foundation for then doing a deeper dive into kind of a sector or an area like payments, where they want to gather still more data. And nothing would make me happier if we could help lighten their load to allow them to go deeper in a more narrow area.
Another interesting question that came up, I'm just trying to find it again here, is, oh, sorry, I see that Amaya still has a doubt. She said that her question is still of everything on the map today, how many and what percentage self-identify as a DPI?
Oh, go for Christina.
Yeah. I mean, thanks for that question. It's a really good one. We tried to look into this and we tried to assess if it matters that they self-identify also. One is it goes into the definition of what is digital ID, what is digital payment, what is a data exchange. Because obviously when we started doing our searches, we couldn't look for just one thing and call that a digital ID or a payments or an exchange. We had to see the terminology that countries used. With data exchanges, for example, they might use a technical architecture to talk about a data exchange system, something like an API gateway or an enterprise service bus, or call it X-Road itself. That gave us a lot of insight on what the terminology is out there. This is also recorded as an insight, if I remember, on the website. With digital IDs and digital payments specifically, it got really complicated. Because we had to put down what features of digital mean. For us, it stood out as functionalities like digital authentication, being able to do your KYC. And a lot of this was informed by the work that the ID4D program has been doing at the World Bank. With digital payments, we try to see how digital does it have to be? Is it an e-wallet? Is it mobile money? Does it have to be an interbank payment system? So definition of digital kept changing. And then stretching it even further, the definition of DPI kept shifting. So instead of us making a value judgment on what countries called ID as DPI or digital ID as DPI for themselves, we said, hey, this is what they said. If you want to use 3 of those criteria to define DPI for your users and for your analysis, you're free to do that. But if you want to use 15, then your segment and your sample gets smaller. And you could scrutinize it in that way, but it purely depends on the purposes of what you want to define digital ID as DPI or digital payments as DPI, and so on and so forth. We can do, it is a very interesting question. So we're happy to take this ahead if you have ideas on how to categorize and which criteria can be used as criteria truly to call out something as digital ID and then digital ID as DPI. We'd love to offer that view on the website at some point. So would be great to stay in touch.
I'm going to pull off 2 more questions here. So the first one is if we have any insights on the return of DPI investment by type, by country, by population, or by use case. And also if we did think about partnering with any international organizations such as UN, World Bank, since they have data on DPIs already.
Christina, maybe let me do one quick answer to those, and I know you have more to say, particularly on that second question. So on the kind of DPI investment, this is actually a project that we're working on separately. What I don't know is, would that feed back into this project over time? I think it'll take several cycles, but we are working right now on a project trying to figure out what is the kind of return on investment or the economic impact of DPI. And I would love for it to inform this. That said, this project is more trying to define, what are the attributes and do they exist? We've steered away so far of trying to evaluate or make judgments about impact. And so again, if we were going to do that, I want to make sure that they are really objective and not us making kind of individual judgments, but based on a methodology that people broadly felt was credible and that could be kind of binary in their assertion. So you could point to it and say, yes, everybody believes that's true. And countries don't feel like we're making arbitrary judgments about their performance. On the second question, oh my gosh, I'm like a goldfish today. Incredible. What was the second question?
The second question was about collaboration with organizations
Yes.
that already did some kind of research, like the World Bank or UN.
Yeah. So you will see on our About page that there's a bunch of organizations, and Africa and India, who we invited to speak at the beginning of this project, is a great example of the type of people who've been amazing partners for us to work with. So we've partnered both with people who've gathered data to try to figure out how we can work with them, both to share our data, but also to leverage their data. But then also on the kind of normative definitional pieces of what makes up an attribute, we did a lot of research that pulled from places like UNDP and others to help us inform us what makes for an effective, safe, and inclusive DPI. And our hope actually in turn is that the inverse will be true, that people will look at our data set and our attributes and say, oh yeah, we should be including those in kind of like the safeguards work or other work that's going on out there as measurable ways of assessing whether or not these safeguards are being assessed or being implemented. Sorry, Christina, but I know you talked to several players as well.
Yes, our website does speak to the contributors for this work. Obviously, the data that you see on the DPI map is a compilation of data that's already been collected from countries by partners like Africa and India, the World Bank. We've been very transparent about reporting the data. If you download our raw data sheets, it also tells you with hyperlinks where each data point comes from, hopefully. So you can choose to treat something as more credible or the other for your own purposes. We would love to partner with more organizations that are doing this. There are a couple of overlapping questions in the chat around, are we planning on including sectoral initiatives? We would love to. The answer is yes. We would love for this map to be a global view and include as much as can be included in the DPI scope, but we would need to say where the data comes from, how clean it is, of what quality it is the organization willing to share data and make it accessible through the DPI map, things like that. So if you have ideas on who the sectoral data sets, where the sectoral data sets can be contributed from, we would love to hear them. And yeah, we're looking forward to a lot more partnerships after this.
We still have a few questions in the chat, but I'm just mindful of time. So I'll pull off one last one, and then I think we can close it off. This last one, I'll try to connect. I think it tries to connect all the points we brought before, but it is, in how many contexts does some combination of identity, payment, and data exchange systems exist together? So I think it's a good one to wrap up and close.
Go for it, Christina.
Oof, I'm going to disappoint you, as I've been disappointing everyone who asks me this question. It depends on what your combination is. It really depends on your definition of identity, payment, and data exchange system. We tried this exercise where we placed weights on, hey, these are the 3 most important, 5 most important attributes and features that we're interested in defining what is the bare minimum ID, payments and exchange we're looking for. And we were very afraid of disappointing and also creating panic about where ID payments and exchanges exist, because it's not easy to put your finger on. So I would put the question back to you to say, what do you want to define it for? And basis that, we might be able to help you look through the framework, look through the data points available, and then create a way to filter to that list and hopefully even host it on the website. But that's definitely the way to go. And we hope that someone uses the data for that very purpose.
Thank you,
Through the
Christina.
hard questions to Christina, but short version is we'd love to work with people. The data is complex to work with. We have limited bandwidth, but we'd love to find ways to expand and think about new research questions that could be asked on top of it. And so if this is of interest, we'd love to talk to you.
Great. David, Christina, Kasim, any other closing remarks before we close here the presentation?
The only thing I'd just like to say again is I'd like to say a big thank you to Co-Develop for help funding this work. And just an enormous thank you to Kasim, Christina, to Julia, to Jordan, and to Africa Nenda and many other partners, Center for Digital Public Infrastructure. It's a huge number of people out there who have found ways to contribute and help out and get on phone calls, push our thinking, help us refine these attributes. We're really grateful for everybody's help in making this happen. And I'm personally feeling an enormous amount of gratitude for just the team here. We've been working so hard, especially in the last several days, as we really tried to race to get this out the door. So just massive thank yous to everybody. And we hope that you find this useful, and we'd really like to hear from you. So please send us feedback, and please find ways to, feel free. Critical contributions, constructive, does not matter. We'd like to hear it. Thank you all so much.